Yeah, man. But understanding brainwashing, understanding what brainwashing is, understanding mind control, understanding propaganda. These types of things need to be thoroughly combed through as well. Everything needed to be thoroughly combed through and analyzed. And also, just as, going back to how I was saying that, also that white people suffered, a great spiritual death during slavery. Black people experienced spiritual defamation in slavery, but white people experience spiritual death. You understand the difference? Black people experience defamation, white people experience death. Not you know. And the reason I'm saying this is because in America's death, the death of the true America, really took place during slavery. Really took place during slavery because just as I was saying, there were white people that were on the Underground Railroad happening. There were white people. So many names that I'm sure we don't even know. Beyond the John Browns and beyond the Thaddeus Stevens or the greatest story that sticks out in my mind. For white people pushing with black people is the story of Charles Sumner. If any of you know what happened to Charles Sumner, Charles Sumner was beat on the Senate floor, was beat to a bloody pulp on the Senate floor for being a nigger lover. Okay, and it's still marinating, and it's still sinking into my mind. It's still registering in my mind how deep that is, that a white man was beat on the Senate floor for being a nigger lover. So we talk about the laws and all this shit, and we talk about the law being upstanding. This white man was beat on the Senate floor for being a nigger lover. In understanding how these types of things have found their way into history, to a point where, even on the job, where there could be some awesome, good-hearted so-called white people that see what's going on, and they can see the racism, but they're in fear, and through the cultivation of fear and through the science of fear as well, and because they see all this bullshit going on, they would like to speak out against it, and they would like to help the black person, but they're in fear of losing their job, so they don't say anything, so it's very, 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 it's very interesting how this psychology has found its way even to right now, even to right now. And see, the way that education was skewed and separated, how I was explaining how black history was kept out of American history, and how this has hurt all of our children, and how all of us have been lied to. All of us have been lied to because of the simple fact of, because of the simple fact that if how different do you think the world would be? How different do you think America would be if in our education systems, you learn that the black man, did the first open heart surgery. The black man did, had the black man done the first blood transfusion in America. The black man built the refrigerator. Black people have made so much. Black man made the lawnmower, the lawn sprinkler, the typewriter. And if you invented the typewriter, you damn near invented the computer, the telegraph. So many things the black man invented under fire. George Washington Carver. People do not thoroughly, and people do not accredit George Washington Carver his true scholarship as being. Arguably, from what I've studied from George Washington Carver, sounds like the greatest scientist ever, in American history, but since it was casted away and called Black history, little so-called white kids and future Americans are robbed of this type of knowledge of who these people are and who these children are, the ones that y'all call thugs and gangsters and all this shit, and most importantly, they were robbed. The children of those ancestors were robbed. And all of those white people and all those so-called white people that did suffer and sacrifice and fight for freedom, because truly, the whole story of freedom, The whole concept of freedom is an African struggle. The whole concept of freedom is the African in America's struggle. The African in America is the struggle for the African in America. You know, the concept of freedom has nothing to fucking do with white people. All right, in one time in history, name me one time in history. If I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. But name me one time in history where white people were fighting to get free in America. Tell me one time in history where the European man was fighting for freedom in America. You know, there was never no time. The only time that white people were invested in the fight for freedom is if they were helping the African in America. You know, and these type of bare facts. You know, these simple facts. You know, some things that would seem so simple. You know, could you know, will reshape history, will reshape society as we know it. You know, and these types of facts, you know, how different would society be if you knew that, you know, if children understood that, and all of these accomplishments, you know, this is just that's just the surface, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg to the production, to everything that the African has provided, you know, to America, without any accreditation for his accomplishments and for his inventions, you know, and for his mind and his creativity. You know, all of this, all of these accomplishments that I speak of, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and most of all, it's important to understand that all of these great things we did under fire, under a war complex. All right, you know, because being with white folk is a war complex. You know, in our history, we were under a war complex. You know, after slavery, post-war and all this shit. You know, we made all of this shit basically under gunfire, under the most extreme, under like the epitome of stress in life. We made all this shit. You know, so who do you think that we were before we ever seen these white people? That's a great question. You know, and before the white man ever seen us, and who do you think we were to make the white man so scared of us that he would do what he's done? You know, and that's ultimately where we are now. You know, in understanding, just like I say, the way that all this applies to us. You know, black, white, and everyone in between. You know, and how this is, you know, this type of conversation has kept us from, you know, progression in society. Very, very, very important. Very important. Very important for us to revisit and us to reanalyze slavery and all of those things in American history, because you cannot put anything behind you. You cannot put anything behind you if you do not put it in front of you and thoroughly analyze it and comb through it first. First, you have to put something in front of you and analyze it thoroughly before you put it behind you. And we are people who have attempted to put all of this behind, and this has ultimately been the reason for the pause in progression in society. You know, and not understanding, you know, these things and how these have been a form of war, and basically black people in America have PTSD, you know, post-traumatic slave